We hardly know their stories. The midwife in Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, who cared for dozens of women, who was later accused of sacrificing babies to Satan, of roasting and eating their bodies. Tortured over 80 days until she confessed and was put to death by hanging or being burned at the stake. The boy in Nigeria in the 21st century, singled out in church by a Pentecostal minister who tells his mother, "Satan is upon your family. It is a boy who is possessed. Your son will be a witch." Boys like him, some as young as 5, are told they are possessed before being given an exorcism. And if that does not go well, being driven from the village or sometimes burned alive. The Great Witch Hunt is the name given to the period of witch hunts that took place in Europe between 1450 and 1750. And the modern witch hunts in sub-Saharan Africa is the name given to for the tens of thousands of children persecuted as witches in Africa in the 21st century. Both are the results of the same conditions of extreme poverty, superstition, and inadequate legal protection for the accused. During the Great Witch Hunt in Europe, between 40,000 and 100,000 people were tried for witchcraft. We have records for many of the trials, but the historical record is incomplete, so we cannot know for certain how many victims there were. 80% of these victims were women. This means that at least 32,000 women were killed during the Great Witch Hunt in Europe. Why did people believe in witches in Europe in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period? And what did they believe? They believed that witches were women that made pacts with the devil in exchange for power. They sealed the deal by fornicating with the devil, depicted as an animal man with horns and cloven hooves, sometimes with featherless wings like a bat. And then these women met to revel together in covens, in meetings called sabbats, where they kissed the devil's buttocks before engaging in wild orgies and feasting on the dead. They might fly to the sabbat on a broomstick or be both there and elsewhere simultaneously. Serious theologians worked out how this could be so. There were 4 factors that went into the persecution of witches in Europe during the late Middle Ages and early modern period. First, great economic crisis. Second, the existence of a particularly vulnerable element of society. 3, belief in the supernatural, and a very popular book that promoted the idea of witchcraft. And 4th, a court system that lacked the safeguards we give defendants today. The first factor was a time of great economic crisis, a 2-year drought followed by widespread deaths and famine. Then the bubonic plague, which wiped out 1/3 of the population of Europe. Many wars, including the one where Joan of Arc was burned as a witch. And those things that happened in the 14th and 15th century, it took a century to recover from. The second factor was the existence of particularly vulnerable population. Women had less economic security than men. Women's jobs were paid less and were less steady. For example, men ran taverns, but women made ale, baked bread, and catered parties, something like a gig economy for women. In hard times, women's income dried up, and many women were widowed or without husbands because of the war. They became beggars and outcasts. They were burdens on their society and subject to scapegoating. The most vulnerable women were elderly without sons. The third factor is a belief in the supernatural. There was already a prevailing belief that people could perform magic. But added to that is a new belief that some women, witches, receive their power by making a pact with the devil, which is heresy and punishable by death. The idea that witches receive their power from the devil comes from a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Witch's Hammer, which was written by Heinrich Kramer in 1487. It became the second most read book in Europe for almost 300 years. Only the Bible sold more copies. John Green says the book reads like aggressively misogynistic fantasy fiction. According to the historian Anne Barstow, 1/5 of the malice constitutes a tirade against women's sexual powers. For example, all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. For the sake of fulfilling their lust, they consort even with devils. The fourth ingredient we have is a court system that does not protect the vulnerable. In the late Middle Ages and early modern period, the municipal court system was being formed and lacked the safeguards we now have in place for defendants. Defendants are coerced with torture to confess, sometimes tortured for months. And of course, they do confess. And then they name accomplices under duress. Sometimes 100 women were rounded up at a time due to the exponential nature of accomplice naming. There were other dubious practices, such as in one trial, the star witness was a child who lived with the prosecutor and was coached for over a year before giving her testimony. Along the way, many rationalists tried to fight the witch hysteria, some of them being burned as wizards. Finally, in 1711, Joseph Addison published an article in a highly respected journal criticizing the irrationality and social injustice of treating elderly and feeble women as witches. Changes in attitude led to the Act of 1735. The Act stated that people cannot possess supernatural powers or make deals with Satan. Thereafter, alleged witches were prosecuted for fraud, not heresy. The same conditions, poverty, a vulnerable population, superstitious belief in witchcraft, actually it is a Christian belief found in the Bible, Exodus 22:18, that says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And inadequate protection under the law, which comes together in present day witch hunting too. We do not have records for all the victims in the child witch hunts of sub-Saharan Africa, but there are tens of thousands of victims that are children. Some of these children are only subjected to bewildering exorcisms. As you know from other talks that I've given, I believe telling a child that he or she is possessed by a demon is already damaging for a child. But some of the exorcisms are so terrible as to be unimaginable. Children have had acid poured on their bodies, or even a 3-inch nail driven into their skulls in an effort to get a confession or drive the demon from the body. To quote Wikipedia, accusations of witchcraft in Africa are a very serious matter, as the witch is the cause of all misfortune, disease, and death. Consequently, the witch is the most hated person in African society and subjected to punishment, torture, and even death. The first factor is poverty. In Africa, 377 million people are living on less than $2 a day. The second factor, a vulnerable population. Children have always been among the most vulnerable members of any society. The third factor is belief in witchcraft and a popular media that promotes the idea. In the film Dispatches, Return to Africa's Witch Children, a village leader, Chief Ecot, says, "The origin of the fear of child witches is linked to a popular film produced by the Helen Ukpabio, founder of the Liberty Foundation Gospel Ministries, called The End of the Wicked, which was released in 1999 in Nigeria." The fourth condition required witch hunts to spread is inadequate protection of the accused by the law. The good news is that African nations have enacted laws prohibiting accusing children of witchcraft and are prosecuting anyone who harms children in this cause, even making it illegal to accuse a child of being a witch. Sometimes this meets with countersuits over religious freedom. The practice of child witch hunts in sub-Saharan Africa is on the decline. I would like to mention a few of the heroes who are fighting to end this abhorrent practice. In 2017, God's Will Akpabio, God's Will is his first name, God's Will Akpabio, a Nigerian senator, took up the cause of ending the abuse of children accused of witchcraft, using the law to go after anyone engaged in harming children in this manner. Sam Itaba has opened a home and a school for children accused of witchcraft called the Child's Rights and Rehabilitation Network, CRARN, and people around the world donate towards its operation. And Leo Igwe is a Nigerian human rights advocate and former representative of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, who specializes in campaigning against and documenting child witchcraft accusations. He has also developed a workshop called I Doubt to teach skepticism, which he uses in workshops that also take place in Africa. I caution you against dismissing the fear of witchcraft as something that only happens in other times and other places. It can happen in the United States. And I won't go into all the hysteria around the Harry Potter and such like that, but this is the most shocking to me. In 2008, Sarah Palin, then the vice presidential nominee, was videotaped at her home church receiving protection against witchcraft. We know there is no such thing as a witch, none that receives supernatural power of any kind, because supernatural power is a fantasy, and belief in it creates the potential for harm. I posted a bunch of resources at the Facebook page, the private Facebook page, if anyone's interested. I warn you, they're extremely disturbing, so you may not want to expose yourself to that.